morning or good evening, everyone. I cannot believe I'm so excited. I saw that someone is here from England and it is 5 p.m. over there. So welcome, welcome. So hello and welcome. Welcome to our third lecture series. Welcome to this conversation and welcome to the work that is bringing racial equity into the child welfare system. My name is Brandy Turner, and I'm the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer for the Department for Children and Families. Today, we welcome a panel of professionals with both lived and worked experiences who will walk us through a conversation on common myths that circulate throughout child welfare. They will lend their expert opinions and challenge us to bring a more multidimensional approach to how we view our children, our families, and the community. As we hear from them today, I hope you will lean into what it means to challenge misconceptions and think about how we can come together and bring a sense of belonging and how we provide services and guidance to our families in some of their most vulnerable times. Our conversation today may test some boundaries for some of you. Please practice mindfulness. Take breaks whenever needed and then re-engage with us. We value your presence and your voice, and we don't want to miss any opportunity to be inclusive. Chanel will provide a quick housekeeping detail for us to help get us started. And again, I want to welcome you, and I look forward to this in-depth conversation around debunking myths within child welfare. Chanel?
Thank you, Brandy. Like Brandy mentioned, I'm going to just provide a couple of housekeeping matters. So, number one, I was going to say that the chat is disabled, but not sure. There was lots of activity that was happening on the chat, so that is awesome. If it has been disabled now, then you will be able to ask your questions through the Q&A, and the host and the panelists will be able to see that. This has been accredited for two CEUs and 2 CLEs. And so just to quickly outline what that process looks like, if you are looking for continuing legal education credit, it's been accredited for 2 in Kansas, and you need to respond to the polls and make sure that you are on for the time allotted. Same thing for the CEUs. It's not necessary that you respond to the polls, but you're more than welcome to do that as well. For the CLEs, you'll get that within 30 days. For the CEUs, please allow 10 days for reporting. The email address, ksracialequity@gmail.com, is where you can ask us any questions if you haven't gotten whatever documents you're needing. This is being live closed captioned. Regarding what to expect, you heard that, right? This is a learning journey. This is our third. We're very excited about where we are just as a state. And then lastly, what I'm going to do is I'm going to be presenting today about myths and the law. And so as you saw, we had the data that was shared with the last 2 sessions. And so today we're going to take a look at what the law has done and how it's done it. So I am the Kansas City Regional Director for the Department for Children and Families, but I am also an adjunct professor. I teach children in the law and health policy in the law. And so it's very fascinating just to see the role that the law plays in perpetuating myths. So allow me a moment to share my screen and we will go ahead and begin. All right, so like I mentioned, this is about myths in the law. And specifically, what I'll be covering today is the Civilization Fund Act of 1819. I'm going to briefly touch on Dred Scott, the decision of 1857, and I'm also going to cover Plessy V Ferguson, which was decided in 1896. So with that, the Civilization Fund Act of 1819 was basically a funding stream that Congress created. And they said, look, we're looking for benevolent individuals. We're looking for folks that are of good moral character because we need some help with civilizing these Native Americans. That's basically what the fund was created for. And so what you had is you had missionaries and church leaders who step forth and they use the funds to create schools in Native territories to teach Native children how to be civilized. And so what is the myth in this, right? What's the myth that Congress perpetuated, which is that Native people are savages and they needed to be saved. So the impact that that had was eventually Indian boarding schools, which is what they're commonly referred to, were opened off reservation. And it was actually led by a former military leader who coined the phrase, kill the Indian, save the child. This was the Carlisle School. And it began many different models began popping up. And so unfortunately, many of the children that attended these schools, they never returned back home. It's important to highlight that Native children have varying experience in Indian boarding schools. So for some, it was a terrifying experience fraught with sexual and physical abuse. But for others, it was an oasis. It was a source of pride, especially when Native children began returning as adults and teaching in these same schools. However, after 1928, so the present day, right, where are we? A report revealed that there was actually a lack of education that was happening, right? They were being taught how to care for the school, but not necessarily how to read and write. There was widespread abuse, and there was just a general failing. And most of the off-reservation Indian boarding schools did close. Wanted to just show you a picture of what the process, right? Basically what the assimilation process looked like for Native children who were at this school. They had to cut their hair, they couldn't speak their language, their culture, all of those different things. So again, the myth that was perpetuated and codified in law. Next, I'm just going to briefly touch on the Dred Scott decision. What you need to know is that it was a terrible Supreme Court decision. So Dred Scott, he ended up suing for his freedom, and he won on the state level, and then it was appealed. He lost. He ended up going to the Supreme Court, and the court came back and said that not only, I read the opinion, and it spent most of the time talking about how African Americans did not deserve and could never be citizens of the United States. That's the myth that Dred Scott perpetuated. And the impact of the worst Supreme Court decision ever was that it invalidated many different laws that the states had set up. And it was really the linchpin which launched the Civil War of 1861. But after that, right, we have the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery and indentured servitude, and then the 14th Amendment for equal protection. But what's important to know about that is, as a result, though, of the 13th Amendment being passed, many different laws began to pop up. So now we're in 1896, Plessy V Ferguson. And in 1896, there was after the 13th Amendment, what began to happen is there were the separation laws, right? Where it said that Black and white folks could not be in the same space. There had to be separate accommodations. And so this was a test case. So Plessy was recruited to actually intentionally violate the law of the land at that time to see if it was constitutional. And so he did that. He was arrested, went to the Supreme Court. And what the Supreme Court said is that the separate Car Act was constitutional, that it did not violate the 13th and the 14th Amendment. And the Supreme Court declared that separate but equal was the law. It was legal. So what was the myth? So the myth that this Supreme Court perpetuated was that separation of the races was for the public good, and that laws could not create equality, right? So that was the myth that Plessy v. Ferguson perpetuated. What it also did, right, what was the impact? this opened the door for Jim Crow. It opened the door for Jim Crow, and it created a second-class citizenship for African Americans in America, and it fueled decades of violence against African Americans. Essentially, it shut Black folks out of many different parts of the society, not able to vote, not able to hold elected offices, redlining, right, where you could live, and who you could marry. And so lynching, something else that's important to note is that lynching became common. And this is just a picture of someone who was lynched. His name was Emmett Till, who was 15 years old, and he violated, according to the South, right, he allegedly whistled at a white woman, and he was lynched and he was killed. And this is his mother, and she had a public, she had an open casket to show the world, right, her son who was murdered in that way. And that also really launched a lot of different things. One of those being another important Supreme Court case, which is like, where are we now? Brown v. Board of Education, which unanimously, meaning all the justices agreed, and it struck down Plessy v Ferguson. So this really created momentum, and we began to see many more civil rights laws that were passed as a result of that. So what's important to note with that, though, is that the last school was desegregated in 2006. So progress has been slow, unfortunately. But I love this quote by Secretary Holland, Deb Holland, who is the first Indigenous person to hold the office of Secretary of the Department of Interior. And she actually has launched in 2021 a investigation into what happened at the Indian boarding schools. Remember, I talked about how a lot of Native children never came home. And so what she's saying is, I know that this process will be long and difficult. I know the process will be painful. It won't undo the heartache and loss we feel, but only by acknowledging the past can we work towards a future that we are all proud to embrace. And so this is just a reminder of the importance of our laws, policies, procedures, and practices, and that we not allow myths to creep into our laws and impact everything. With that, I am going to kick it over to Ashley to do an introduction for our speakers.
Thank you, Chanel. Hello, everyone. I'm Ashley Smith, and I'm the Child and Family Advocate for Care Portal. I'm really excited to introduce our three esteemed panelists for today. And first, we have Ms. Ruby White Starr, who is an Indigenous Latina and Co-Chief Executive Officer of Paminar Latino. During the last 25 years, she led domestic violence shelters and transitional housing programs, provided consultation and training in almost every major U.S. city and territory and across South America, secured and administered over $15 million in funds, and led the implementation of more than 50 federal projects to respond to violence against women. Before launching Latinos United for Peace and Equity, Ruby served as the Chief Strategy Officer and Director of Casa de Esperanza's National Latina Network for Healthy Families and Communities. Prior to the NLN, Ruby spent the bulk of more than 15 years as Assistant Director of the Family Violence Department for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. Welcome, Ruby. We're certainly glad that you agreed to be here. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of the importance of you joining this panel?
I would say it's really important to me to be here. We just launched, received funding to do the National Center to Advance Peace for Children, Youth, and Families. So we will be the new resource center that does child welfare and domestic violence work. And what's relevant about that here is that the most important thing for us is to make truth-telling the new innovation. And so that's what's important. That's why it's important for me to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you for being here, Ruby. Next, we have Ms. Deidra Calco. She is the founder of Go Within, Not Without, LLC, where she is a consultant to leaders in public child serving systems, a transitional life coach to an adoption triad, and a motivational speaker and trainer. Deidra is a late discovery adoptee, and her career has mirrored her life in many arenas. She has years of career experience in public child welfare, juvenile justice, and developmental disability agencies, where she has advanced to administrative roles. Deidra was the first African-American bureau chief under the Department of Child Safety to oversee case management and permanency of children in the child welfare system. She has received training through the Annie E. Casey Foundation, the Casey Foundation, and is a suicide interventionist. Deidra directed program development and led peer parents to provide excellent support to other parents involved in child welfare, juvenile justice, and developmental agencies. Deidra is also an author in the Igniting the World with Our Voices anthology, which will be out in mid-February. Her chapter is called Unworthy to Be. Congratulations on that, Ms. Deidra. And can you tell us a little bit about what led you to say yes to joining today?
Absolutely. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. I am here because, as you said, Ashley, this has been my life, not just my professional life, but my growing up as a late discovery adoptee. I didn't know who I was. No one felt the need to tell me. And so this has been very important to me as far as debunking myths, not just for my personal life, but because of the work I did as the adoptions manager, as responsibility for permanency. This is very important. It's very important topics. And what you guys are doing in Kansas is absolutely wonderful.
Thank you so much. So glad you're here. And to round out the panel, Dr. Alan J. Detlef is the Dean of a Graduate College of Social Work at the University of Houston and the inaugural Makanda Brown O'Connor Endowed Dean's Chair. Prior to entering academia, Dean Detlef worked in the child welfare system as a caseworker and an administrator. He received his bachelor's degree in social work from TCU, a master's in social work and PhD from the University of Texas at Arlington. Dean Detlef's work focuses on addressing and eliminating the impacts of structural and institutional racism on Black children and other children of color impacted by child welfare system intervention. He is co-founder of the Up-In movement, a collaborative movement that seeks to end the involuntary separation of children from their parents through abolition of foster care and the child welfare system. Thank you so much for being here. And can you tell us a little bit about your willingness to join this discussion?
Absolutely. First, let me say just thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you today. As you said, I started my career in the child welfare system and worked in that system for many years, and then spent many years after I left the system coming to understand my complicity in the harm that the system causes. And coming to understand that and then studying for decades the problem of racism and racial bias in the system, I learned how important debunking these myths are, because it's the myths that are embedded within the child welfare system that have perpetuated the problem of disproportionality. And it's the myths that exist within the child welfare system that perpetuate the harm that the child welfare system continues to produce. So addressing and debunking those myths is really an essential first step in eliminating the harm that the system produces.
Thank you so much. We are very excited and looking forward to you guys' panel discussion. And so I will turn this over to Brandy.
Thank you, Ashley, and welcome to all our panelists. We are very excited to have you here today and look forward to what you have to say around these myths. I have the pleasure of starting off with Ms. Ruby Whitestar, and we are going to discuss the myth of colorblindness and the dangers of colorblindness. We often hear a lot of people saying, I treat everyone the same and I don't see color. So Ms. Ruby, what do you have to say about this myth?
Yes, I want to begin by talking about colorblindness in the context of culture and provide context for the term, so we're all basically talking about the same thing. So when talking about color, race, ethnicity, it's really important to understand that all meaning is assigned. We see color and interpret behavior through our own cultural filter of what our worldview tells us is happening. And the myth or the self-deception and institutional deception of colorblindness is, to me, a byproduct of white privilege, which is why it's important to put this in the broader context of culture. The way we used to talk about race and ethnicity, I think, historically has been through the lens of cultural competence. Historically, the way service providers, policymakers, researchers thought about race and equity was through that lens, which essentially constituted attempts to serve, govern, evaluate those with which people shared no frame of reference. And so in this framework, they often didn't know themselves. They didn't analyze themselves. They didn't look at their own culture and their own whiteness and how that contributed to the challenges that we were seeing. They may not recognize the tools they were using to measure success. They didn't unpack who created them, who was involved. The most common framework for describing colorblindness within a cultural competency framework was developed by Terry Cross. And there's a lot to critique in the model and in the idea that anyone can ever be competent or proficient, that culture can be reduced to a technical skill, or that it has utility to a racial, ethnic, and intersectional lens. But I want to share it today with some of my own adaptations to get us on the same page of what we mean when we're talking about colorblindness, but within the context not of cultural competence, but of developing our own cultural capacity. So I'm going to share this real quick, just because seeing a picture is oftentimes much easier. So what I have adapted is, instead of thinking of it as a cultural competence continuum, I think of it more like a cultural capacity continuum, and what that looks like when we are thinking of these. Oftentimes when we think of color not mattering, it's oftentimes because we're thinking of the things that used to happen in the world, the cultural destruction, genocide that occurred. That's what we see as racism, and that there's not as much of that, anymore. So we see it as something we don't need to worry about. That's when we're having this harmful view of culture that's what's called cultural destruction. We also oftentimes mostly operate in this one area of cultural incapacity where we're demeaning differences, where we don't have the capacity to respond. And so that's when our services are for everyone oftentimes is used, because whatever is created for the dominant culture is good enough for everyone. And then this idea of cultural blindness that oftentimes people wear as a badge of honor is very much about dismissing differences. It's saying that they don't matter, that what's good for all, it encourages assimilation. And it's extremely problematic. Now, the Cross model talked about cultural competence and cultural proficiency, which obviously is not something that we can ever attain. However, when we talk about doing equity work and seeing, recognizing and acknowledging differences, is to always be engaged in cultural practice. And that's when we're doing continually engaging in anti-racist learning and practice, and expanding our resources and committing resources to do the work differently, and hiring, seeking advice, and consulting with the community we're serving, and all these things. And then, of course, cultural influence would be then when we're learning and growing because of differences, and that would include when you're adding to the knowledge base around these issues, when you're developing culturally relevant resources and programs, when you're disseminating research that is grounded in all of these realities. So just so that we're on the same page, that's kind of the framework I wanted us to be thinking about when we talk about color blindness. And sorry, I've got to come back to my notes real quick. So why this matters is that no one is culture free. America and Americans have a culture. One American may not be like another American, but there are core values and beliefs that permeate the national culture. And these values and beliefs include principles that are rooted in white supremacy. And pretending that there is such thing as color blindness puts us in this default of operating in a way that perpetuates this white supremacy, which is not only socially accepted, but socially enforced to maintain societal control, with often in our own work with concepts like objectivity, scientific, valid, reliable, rational. They prove powerful in academia and scholarship, but it's a great irony that these serve as a veneer for maintaining white privilege, white male power, inequity grounded in racism, that we often refute in our rhetoric, but maintain in our practice. And so it's really important that we strive to dismantle racism And to do that, we need to account for color from the very inception of when we're creating programs or developing research, not as a not as a small thing that we do or integrate later. We oftentimes think of universal goals being adequate for everyone. For example, a universal goal might be that all children have access to a pleasurable and meaningful education. And they're important, that is important, but if we don't focus on color, if we don't focus on promoting equitable outcomes, then we're gonna start and end there. What we're gonna decide to do maybe is focus on resources and support to cultivate and retain good teachers. We might have some specialized curriculum and increase our educational standards. But if we are not thinking about lower income communities of color, then we're not going to also add nutritious meals, promoting stable housing, giving people access to healthcare as a core list of strategies that need to be implemented for children to have that education. If you want to reach African American and Latino children, that we need to include curricula and approaches that teach relevant history, which oftentimes does not. They don't get to learn about their own people. We don't have a curricula that counters the unconscious impact of the pervasive negative messages and stereotypes and way that they're treated in the community. And we could go on. And so that is really important for us to consider. For 2 decades, activists have exposed this is particularly important in child welfare. I want to, make sure that I don't end without talking about that, because for 2 decades, activists have exposed the racist family surveillance system that includes mandated reporters, which are often unaware or colorblind of the fact of how much the color affects their reporting. For example, a 2017 study, this is teachers and law enforcement and healthcare workers and the ones who primarily are reporting to child welfare. A study estimated that 53% of all Black children and their parents will experience a report to child welfare before their 18th birthday. And hospital records in Philadelphia in one study showed that Black and Latinx toddlers hospitalized for fractures were 5 times more likely to be evaluated for child abuse and 3 times more likely to be reported to child protection with the exact same injuries and explanations. So this kind of work, especially in child welfare, also includes pathologizing cultural values and parenting practices that diverge from the parenting ideal embodied in white middle-class models. And it's very important that we don't, because these are codified in discriminatory policies and assessments that contribute to racial equities. Research has found, for example, that women who experience domestic violence can parent just as well as those who haven't. But despite this, they're routinely mandated to parenting classes because of victim blaming biases that they're allowing themselves to be abused. And one of the problems with that is these are primarily, oftentimes women of color. And research has established that most parenting information is biased. It's mostly conducted on studies on children in US and other educated, industrialized, rich, white, English-speaking countries. And this bias becomes entrenched then in everything that we do and in the ways that we teach parents the appropriate way. Less than 3% of study participants that contribute to that knowledge come from Central and South America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East, although they are 85% of the world's population. And these are all examples of how we continue to perpetuate. What is necessary instead is to expose and challenge these racist structures. And that's not going to happen without great risk. Just last year, or right after the George Floyd incident, 46 state domestic violence and sexual assault coalitions joined together to write a collective letter about reforming the systems that are designed to control people rather than offer real help. And the ones that have been advanced by Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. And as a result of that, they have faced adverse consequences from entrenched systems and political pressures. And that's exactly the same in child welfare. A recent discussion with a very high-level child welfare administrator on a project in a meeting, she said, "We cause harm and devastation to families of color every day with impunity." And when we asked her to go on record, they refused, convinced without question that there would be great retaliation to both themselves and other parties involved. But solutions, as I said in the beginning, require truth-telling, restoration and engagement of those most affected, because involvement in the child welfare and custody systems causes irreparable harm, especially to Black, Indigenous, and Latinx families. And so we have to stop with the semantic adjustments and stop advancing the same strategies that aren't creating any change. Instead, we have to take accountability and reimagine a system that actually supports families. We have to not stop tweaking and start reimagining with those most impacted.
Thank you for that, Ruby. I really appreciate that. As we get prepared, because what we're going to do now is do some Q&A, some reflection, and some thinking on the Padlet. But I want to invite the other panelists in as we talk about, you really kind of hit where we were going with this, is how is the comfort of colorblindness dismissive to the individual experience? And you said a lot, but I'm just wondering if there's any more we could share about that. How does the comfort of sameness and colorblindness really just discount the lived experience someone may have? And I'll open that up to any of our panelists to get us started.
I would just add onto what Ruby said. I mean, first, just to thank you for acknowledging how racism and racial bias plays out in the system, but also to add to this myth in the sense that the system itself perpetuates this myth by practicing in a colorblind manner when they disproportionately separate Black and Indigenous children from their families and then place them in homes with white people and pretends like that's not harmful. That practice happens all the time, and the system hasn't done a good job of addressing or even acknowledging the harm that results from that. So the system perpetuates the idea of colorblindness by not seeing color when they're forcibly separating children from their families and then placing them in white homes.
Thank you for that, Dr. Detloff. Before we continue, go ahead, Ms. Deidra.
I'm sorry, Brenda. The only thing I wanted to add to what was said was actually, it's right, 53% of our children, of African American, of BIPOC children, are those that are investigated. And if we're not looking at who they are and where they came from, it's a major travesty, and we see that everywhere. And so we've got to change the narrative. We've got to change the script. And people have got to be aware of what they're saying and when they're saying things that could be harmful, because I hear that all the time. Oh, I don't see color. And that's a travesty.
Yes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take all these thoughts and we're going to invite you in to give your reflection on colorblindness and how you see it play out in the work that you're doing. You saw in the chat that a link for Padlet is coming up, and we're going to share our screen in just a moment. If you weren't with us before, just to kind of go over Padlet again, it's a great way for us to reflect and have a conversation and allow your voices to be heard. There's so many of you on the call today, and we're very excited about it. We wish we could just open up chat and just have you speak that way, but it's just not possible. So we want to honor you in the best way we know how, so we're going to use the Padlet. When it comes up, first, you want to go ahead and click on the link so that you have it up on your screen so that you can participate. If you have an account for Padlet, you want to be careful not to be signed in if you want to remain anonymous, because if not, when you do post, your name will show up on that. When it comes up, you will see that there will be options to add a post. And this is where we want to have you address the question as well, the myth of the dangers of colorblindness. And then again, how does the comfort of sameness discount the individual experience? We would love to hear from you. When you do post, you have the option of responding to someone else's post. You can like it, you can add your own comments, and we can just have this trail of comments just going down the page. So feel comfortable and feel free to comment however you would like to, remaining respectful to the conversation and to each other. So as we get started, I just want to go ahead and open it up again to Miss Ruby, because what I heard you say is that a meaning is always a sign. So no matter how we say we don't see color, there's going to be meaning assigned to that. So I would love if you could expound on that a little bit more and just kind of open up our conversation today.
Tell me more about what you mean.
So you
So
say
we need to
meaning
go to
is
the
a
next
sign.
minute too.
Oh, yeah.
We're running late.
I really appreciated that you said meaning was a sign, because, you know, we want to pretend that we don't see it. You know, when we see a person, we may not see their skin color, but there are all these, what I will call microaggressions and implicit biases that we have to address within ourselves and within one another, right? So when you say that meaning is a sign, what I'm wondering is, you know, go deeper into that thought. What else would you say to someone who continues to say, I don't see color?
Well, that's like saying, you know, I don't draw conclusions from anything. I think one of the things that we do often in when we're working with child welfare, for example, is we ask, what would you do if you, you know, if you saw, you know, a 7-year-old and a 5-year-old on a subway by themselves? And we know that all of us would look around like, where's their parents? You know, if we see them there alone. And that is the norm in Japan, for example, in Asian cultures. And we can go through that all day of, you know, something that they would see in the African American community. They are making judgments and assessments on it, and they don't recognize how those are rooted in white supremacy. And I think that's one of the biggest problems until people can become educated. I mean, we see people don't even know the history of the systems that they're working and operating in. They think that promoting equity is like, oh, you know, there's a church that I'm connecting with, and I brought this food to them instead of that food. And it's beyond that. It's institutional, it's systemic, it's structural, and that it's a void to that because they're looking outside at people and fixing people for problems instead of looking within and seeing, you know, how they have been socialized in white supremacy.
Yes, I like the comment that you made, that it's important for them to know themselves before they start making assumptions on what they're seeing and how they feel like they need to fix it. So I really appreciate that. We're getting a lot of comments on Padlet. I'm glad that you were able to pick that up pretty quickly, almost to the point where I almost cannot see what's being noted here. So we have a lack of awareness is dangerous. You know, we need to see color. It just perpetuates just harm. I'm seeing
Especially our own color.
Yeah. Yes. So I want to go ahead and open this up again to Ms. Deidra or Dr. Detlau. Any other reflections on this color blindness, this idea of color blindness, and how it really impacts what we do in our work? Ms. Deidra, no? Okay. Dr. Okay. All right, so I think what we'll do now is we will go ahead and transition over to myth number 2. Oh, we'll take a poll first.
Can you read the poll question, Brandy?
Yes, the poll is, have you been successful with any New Year's resolutions so far? And I'm going to say no. Some people say they don't believe in resolutions. Any thoughts on that from the panel or any of our lecturers while they answer that question?
Do a new resolution every month, Brandy.
Every month, okay.
And it's still January, right? You still have some time. You still have some time.
That's true. All right, and here are the results. So most of us don't have any resolutions. All right, well, that doesn't mean we don't have goals, right? We just don't have resolutions. Take it away, Abby.
Yes, so I'm not sure what that tells us about this group, except for we're not big on making resolutions, which that's totally fine. We are going to now move into myth number 2, and we're going to hear from Deidra Calco. And the myth number 2 that she is going to be speaking to is, it's only the child that matters, and this often demonizes and dismisses the family. So Deidra, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Abby. I am very happy to be here today. I'd like to start out with telling you, I want everything I say you're not going to agree with. We know that. So take the nuggets that you can and those that you can't leave. What I don't want you to ever hear me saying is that we leave children in danger, because I never, ever believe that. I believe we do all we can to keep children safe. And when I say we, I don't mean just child welfare agencies. I also mean the community. And that's very important when we look at this myth around demonizing parents. Let me just give you a couple of facts, and that is our federal law, the Title IV program, requires states to make reasonable efforts to preserve and reunify families. So first of all, we know that's our first order of business, is not to remove if we don't have to, and when removed, do all we can to return children. And Kansas's values, there were 10 I was looking at, and they always talk about children deserve to be protected. Children should maintain with their family whenever possible, all of the wonderful things that we want, not only for our community, but for ourselves. And what we know is for sure that when children are removed, it may cause physical and psychological severe impact. And on top of that, now you're saying things, demonizing or saying things bad about their parents or their family. That really can cause depression, even in younger children. We look back at primal wound when children are adopted and they have a connection to their birth mother. I can remember the things that people told me about me being young. And what they said was, you had big eyes and you stared. Wonder if that was because I was listening for something that I heard when I was in vitro. Maybe I was listening for a voice. Maybe it was the soothing of my birth mother. Who knows? I don't know, because that was not a conversation I had. But when children are in foster care, they are already feeling different than other children in the community. And so we want to watch not only our words that we say, but how we say them. So my mother used to call me a hook-nosed heifer. And my parents, I was raised in a Black family. I am biracial. And I can remember looking in the mirror and thinking, what does that mean? Whose nose does this look like? Maybe my mom had an affair. Never discussing adoption, never discussing why both of my parents, who looked like coffee with rich chocolate and milk in it, why I looked different from them, why I had different hair. And that's not, they didn't demonize at that point. When my mother, I told her that I knew I was adopted, her words to me was, your parents weren't shit and you ain't gonna be shit. Can you imagine how that made me feel? The same thing when children have been removed because of whatever reason. We know that it's usually no fault of their own. They are removed and placed in the system because of a judgment that says that something has gone wrong in that family dynamic. And all of those pressures, we remove them from their community, their schools, and then they either hear too much about how awful their parents are or too little about who their parents are. And when children don't know who they are, how do they know who to be as they grow older? And so I would ask that you really think about, no matter where you work in this spectrum of working with children and families, that children are going to ask questions, and they're going to ask the hard questions. So if you are child welfare or a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer, and you have a connection with those children, Think about what you might say to them. You don't want to give too little information because they know when you're lying. They want you to be authentic. We want a society, and I believe that that's why we are all here doing the work that we are doing. We want a productive society. And the way to do that is not by demonizing the parents, even if a child cannot return home. You know, when you hear about this, the same thing that Ruby was saying, it's not just in child welfare, but when parents demonize each other, you know, your dad is this, your mom is that, how that might make a person feel, how it might make you feel if you heard those things, and how a child who doesn't know who they are or where they belong, when they hear things about their parents, that touches them. When I found out my father was a pharmacist, my birth father was a pharmacist, it did my whole soul good. And then I couldn't say too much of, that's too deep for Deidra. Deidre's father was a janitor. Didn't mean he wasn't smart. But those are the things that we take with us that impact our lives. I have seen this not just in my life, but I'm in all kinds of groups. And this young woman said the other day that her birth certificate said, due to the circumstances by which this child was born. And she says, now I know why I've never felt worthy. Now I know why I don't believe in myself. Those are the things we want to avoid. There's a young kid that's in my life. She's 10 years old. And when her parents are separated, she lives with her father. And when I see her and say to her, you look just like your dad, she says to me, I look like my mom too. And I have to take pictures out of mom and show her, yes, your cheeks are like mom, your fingers are like mom. And that makes her stand and feel a little better about who she is. It makes her stand taller. It makes life better for her when we talk about those things. I have a young lady that I met at 18 years old. She is 32, grew up in foster care, didn't know who she was. We know the story, right? 40, 50 placements, different churches, didn't know what religion she should be. And I talked to this young lady every morning. She met me when she was 18 years old. I am her connection to someone who is older than her, to reasoning. That's not okay. 18, and she had nobody in her life that she at this point can say was a connection for her. And those are the reasons for me that this is so very important, that we do not demonize parents. Now, some may say this the other way around. We talk about parents to our children, and we know that they are important. And so we would not do that. That's true. And so then you wouldn't be harming children by not telling them about their parents. I'm asking you to be authentic. I'm asking you to look at the data. We know the school to prison pipeline is real. We know what happens to children who have low self-esteem and don't know who they are. And I would encourage you to support others in understanding how important it is not to demonize, not to make children believe that they are not worthy.
Thank you, Deidra. I really appreciate those words. And I just hearing you talk about that from both your professional and your personal experience is just really meaningful. And I think that we all do need to be thinking through these ways, and just reading that second part of that myth too, thinking about just dismissing the family. I think oftentimes that's the nice thing that people do, right? I'm not saying anything negative, but you're in a better place now. And that's how we're, that's how we're really caring for that child. I'm going to open it up again to the rest of you all too. We have a few more minutes before we're going to start our Padlet. If any of you all have anything to say about this, I know that this is a myth that maybe we don't say it like this all the time. We don't say it's only the child that matters, but oftentimes I'm thinking of different spaces, adoption, foster care, that parent is only focused on the child. They are that child's advocate. And so sometimes they don't mean to necessarily say that it's only the child, but that's maybe what's in their heart. And then these things happen accidentally, but whether it's, I think whether it's purposeful or not, we have to think of intent versus impact. So yeah, I would love to hear what you all have to think about that, say about that.
They do say it very often. We work very closely. And you're right, it's sometimes in different ways with different words. But this is particularly relevant in my work in domestic violence. Where it's best interest of the child is put ahead, but because what happens in domestic violence is there's two victims. This is the way we see it. Oftentimes when a parent reaches out for help and they come to the attention of child welfare, what research has taught us is that the best way to protect the child in a domestic violence situation is to protect their mother. And yet, I would say systems still operate with what I call a hierarchy of safety. Because what they do instead is that there's a charge, I don't know if some of you are familiar, that's called failure to protect. So basically when a woman needs assistance, she's given all of these demands, a safety plan. She has to leave her abuser, which is actually unconstitutional. You can't force people. They make him invisible. You can't have any contact. You have to make him go away, as if the family can make him disappear as well. Because again, he doesn't matter. The only one that matters is the child. So they operate, this failure to protect is kind of a term that's used when maltreatment hasn't occurred yet, but the risk is present, and children are removed for it all the time. Particularly research shows in Latinx families, for example, and perhaps it's because they're less likely to get into relationships, right? Because there's all of these coercive things that are put into place on what needs to be done. And for many communities of color, this is especially problematic because they're disproportionately in child welfare. They're disproportionately affected by poverty. Economic independence is a factor in domestic violence cases. It's very easy to say they're choosing their abuser, by staying with him over their kids, when maybe they're just choosing abuse for themselves over homelessness for themselves and their children. We tend to oversimplify things when we look at just the child outside of all the other contexts. And also, we don't think about how limiting just access to justice is for communities of color, who are often with men that are Black, Indigenous, who bring their own complicated histories of abuse and oppression, who we've seen, it's been exposed how that they can't call for the same help that everyone else has. And so for me, it's just really important, particularly in the context of how damaging it is in domestic violence cases, when we act as if children don't live with mothers, in families, in communities, as if somehow you can do anything in their best interest by removing and eliminating all of the potential protective factors that research demonstrates that could bring. And so that's particularly.
What child do we know that has raised themselves? How do you have a child without a family, right?
Right.
And that's so important to me. The other thing I want to mention real quick before we go there, and that is, I don't want to harm the child. I don't want to talk about this bad stuff with them. You know what? They already know. Somebody's telling them. So why not be the person who can support them in understanding who they are, as opposed to feeling worse about themselves for what has happened to them?
Thank you so much. The Padlet link is in the chat, so feel free to go ahead and click on that. The question for this myth is, what are the ways that we can remember the importance of the entire family when making decisions, recommendations, referrals, and policy? And Dr. Detlef, if you have anything to contribute while people are just getting started here, we'd love to hear that.
But the only thing I would add while people are adding their thoughts here is, I think it's important to know for the people who care about this work and are on this webinar, in addition to this myth, there's an opposite agenda that's being pushed by some in the field that are trying to say that those of us who are pushing for some radical changes, like there's a movement to repeal ASFA, the Adoption and Safe Families Act, because of the harm it does. Critics of that will say these activists don't care about children, they only care about parents, and we're putting the needs of parents too high above children. So there's an opposite agenda that's being pushed in the field too by some people.
Thank
It's
you.
particularly prevalent because domestic violence advocates don't care about children also is a myth that they only care about, which instead what we actually care about is the research that demonstrates that, that you have to, to have good outcomes, you have to work with moms and children together, because that is where all their protective factors are going to come from. Becky Aiken's on this call. We're on the Quality Improvement Center. I'll mention right now, if you go to that website and find out about all the approaches that are trying to be implemented so that we can stop using all of these, perpetuating all of these horrible myths around this particular problem, so we can have better approaches, especially in domestic violence cases.
Okay, I'm not sure if our Padlet for this one is working right now. So I will just go ahead and say this out loud. We're thinking again about what are the ways that we can remember the importance of the entire family when making decisions, recommendations, referral, and policy. So if you would like to, let's go ahead and, okay, I think it's working now. So we're going to take a couple minutes and go ahead. Feel free to put some thoughts in that Padlet. And Ruby, I loved all of the research that you were referencing and things like that. I think that might be interesting for people. So maybe that's something that you could either drop in the chat or just drop to us, the other panelists in the group, so that we can send that out to people.
I can send it to you after. I don't have it readily available here to drop.
No, that's perfect. That'd be great. Thank you.
I will find a couple of websites though where you can get a lot of it.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We really appreciate that. Okay, just reading through some of these. Mindfulness, be mindful of every construct that defines each person. Ooh, Brandy, I see I lost it. Okay, mindfulness. We're just going to go with that. I can't read them as fast either, including the whole family. It's about children, family well-being, not just children. Let's see. Oh, I like this one. Everyone is a collection of their experiences. I think that relates a bit to the myth that we were talking about earlier too, about colorblindness, right? If you say that I don't care about your birth parents, your first family, what does that say about that child who is biologically a product of those other parents, right? So I think it's important to think about how all of these myths that we're talking about affect the whole family. Let's see, we'll do a couple other ones. Remembering that people have situations that we might not know all the information about. That's really important. Looking at the big picture, not just one little piece of it. Maintaining the ability to keep contact between parents and children whenever possible. Systems approach to include all family members and community when possible, and the importance of honoring culture, beliefs, values, religious beliefs, identities, listening to everybody in the family, listening to their input, keeping in mind that a child often cares deeply for their family and policies should reflect that. These are some great ideas, and I know that the Padlets are moving really fast and we're seeing lots of information. All of these things will be available on our website after this webinar. So if there's something that you missed, we would love for you to go back and read through those things and interact with that information. We're so excited to be able to provide that for you all. We are going to take a short break right now. Feel free to get up, stretch your legs. Would love for you to keep your screen on. I believe we're either going to try and show the welcome video that you may have missed at the beginning or some recap slides of our first 2 sessions. So we are going to break now and come back at 12:40. So thanks so much for joining us.
Welcome.
Welcome.
Welcome to the Kansas Racial Equity Collaborative. I'm Laura Howard, Secretary for the Kansas Department for Children and Families. Our agency delivers social services for vulnerable Kansans and is committed to healthy communities.
I'm Erica Glenn, Urban Church Ambassador for Care Portal. Care Portal creates connections for families using the church, community, and technology.
I'm Michelle Moore-Carney, Dean of the University of Kansas School of Social Welfare. Our premier research university is striving to reinvent, innovate, and transform and educate through quality education, research advancement, and community engagement.
Our organizations are committed to courageous and critically important conversations.
We are launching into a statewide learning journey on the epidemic of Black and brown children being overrepresented in the foster care system, having worse outcomes at every point in the system, and leaving the foster care system with limited family connections.
This conversation is long overdue. We must reimagine business as usual and begin to make systemic and long-lasting changes together.
The Kansas Department for Children and Families is leading the Racial Equity Collaborative because since DCF's inception in 1973, we have not focused enough on the harm Black and brown families experience in the foster care system. This must change.
Care Portal is involved in the Racial Equity Collaborative because healthy families create healthy communities.
The KU School of Social Welfare is involved because we are driven by our guiding principles of diversity, equity, and inclusion for individuals, families, and communities.
The Kansas Racial Collaborative brings together those directly and indirectly linked to the child welfare system for a statewide learning journey with 4 learning lectures and debriefs spanning 6 months.
There is also a dedicated website and listserv which will amplify our learning about racial equity in child welfare.
The Racial Equity Collaborative will conclude with an in-person, invitation-only symposium sponsored by Casey Family Programs on April 15th, 2022 on KU's campus in Lawrence.
We need you.
We need you.
We need you to be a part of this movement and learning journey because the well-being of children, families, and communities depends upon it.
Welcome back, everyone.
I am pleased to move us into our next panelist, Dr. Alan Detlef, and we're going to be addressing myth 3 and 4. Myth 3, it's poverty, not racism, controlling for poverty and finding race is still a factor. And myth 4 is we are saving children. The white savior complex and how this harms Black and brown children. I'll turn it to you, Dr. Detlef.
Thanks, Becky. I appreciate it. And I have a few slides just to kind of walk us through some major points. So I'll go ahead and share those. So here, I wanted to start out by talking a little bit about how we got to this point of this debate. So going through some of the origins of the debate. And what we've seen over the years, this starts with how our initial framing of racial disproportionality, when we first came to understand this, many decades ago, and how findings from the national incidence studies were used to frame disproportionality. When we first started to understand disproportionality, or the overrepresentation of Black children and other children of color in the system, we knew from national incidence studies prior to 2010 that there were no differences in rates of maltreatment between Black children, white children, children of other races. But we saw this huge disproportionality happening in the system. So the conclusion was made, there are no differences in rates of maltreatment. We have this overrepresentation. There must be a problem of racism in the system. And that led our thinking for many years. Around early 2010s, there started to be some critiques of the racial disproportionality, efforts to address racial disproportionality. And those critiques were quickly followed by the release of the most recent national incidence study, what we call the NIS4, which showed for the first time that there were some differences between rates of maltreatment, and showed in some cases that Black children were more likely to be maltreated than children of other races. And it also showed a very strong relationship between poverty and maltreatment, and at the same time showed that Black children were significantly more likely to be living in poverty than children of other races. And that began this dialogue about the interconnectedness between poverty and maltreatment. And what we saw in the field, the emergence of this idea of disproportionate need, which was a concept coined by some researchers who strongly advocated for these discussions about it's poverty, not racism, talking about disproportionate need that Black children and families experienced, which resulted in their disproportionate involvement in the system. But what we really know about poverty and maltreatment is important to point out here, because we know that both of those things are true. We know that poverty is significantly associated with maltreatment, and we know that racism is a significant problem in the child welfare system, or as I call it, the family policing system. Yes, poverty contributes to maltreatment, but that doesn't discount all of the evidence that we have about the connection between racism and racial bias and how decisions are made in the system. But the real challenge has been how some of the people who've advanced this idea of disproportionate need talk about racial bias, particularly in academic spaces and in the studies they write, but those have a lot of impact on child welfare policy and practice. And many of these researchers will openly say in their studies that racial bias is not a problem in the system. Doing trainings that focus on reducing racial bias are a waste of time by the system. The system shouldn't be investing in their efforts because it's only about poverty. And they'll completely ignore the data that we do have about the problem of racial bias in the system. And that relates to this next point about how data and evidence are misused to perpetuate this narrative. And I have evidence in quotes here, not to say that evidence isn't important. Evidence is important, but the idea of what we've come to know as evidence has been largely misconstrued by some people who feel strongly about this issue to try to very narrowly focus on only certain types of evidence. Highly quantitative studies that use statistical controls to show that when you control for many, many factors, the only factor that seems to predict this issue of racial disproportionality is poverty. And they will use that to say, see, there is no problem with racism or racial bias in the system. It's only poverty. One that ignores all of the studies that don't show that, the studies that do show that racial bias is a problem. But two, it also ignores all of the qualitative studies that have been done for decades that have documented the experiences of parents in the system, particularly Black parents, who have given their thoughts and their testimonies about how racism has impacted them in the system. So what we've seen is research used as a form of oppression in and of itself by saying that research that highlights the voices and experience of parents are not important. Research that shows parents' experiences of racism is not important, and we shouldn't be paying attention to that. And it's also really important to point out that statistically, we really can't separate between poverty and race because of the way that poverty has been racialized over the years. The system, society, treats poor Black mothers very differently than it treats poor white mothers. That can't be disentangled by statistics, but that absolutely influences decisions that are made in the system. What's really important to point out here that when we're talking about racial disproportionality, racial disparities, overrepresentation, what we know is that racism is at the core of all of this. So anyone who tells you it's poverty, not racism, they're not telling you the truth. That's not true. Racism undergirds all of this because, as I mentioned, yes, poverty is a significant contributor to maltreatment. Yes, Black children and families are more likely to be living in poverty. But why is that so? The answer, as I'm sure many of you know, is because of centuries of historical and current racism that impacts why Black families are more likely to be living in poverty. And Chanel's presentation at the beginning did a really good job of looking at some of these policies. But I think it's important here to just focus on this historical lens of racism in this country and acknowledge that the practice of forcibly separating Black children from their parents began over 400 years ago in the United States through human chattel slavery, and now continues today by the child welfare system. But we can't ignore the origins of that practice. What happened then after the abolition of slavery is that policies were intentionally created to maintain the oppression of Black Americans. Going back to the Jim Crow laws, as Chanel talked about, Black codes, the way that the GI Bill was implemented. All of these things have led to what we call the income gap between Black and white families, the wealth gap. It's led to differences in education and employment. But all of the policies that have been constructed in the United States over the last couple centuries have been intentionally designed to keep Black families in poverty. So that's one part of it. We also know that racism and the experience of racism significantly impacts health and stress. We know that racism is directly tied to the health and health disparities that exist. We know that racism significantly contributes to stress, and those things are associated with contact with the system as well. And then lastly, again, I mentioned the GI Bill, but things like racial residential segregation, differences in housing policies, concentrated poverty, mass incarceration, over policing, all of these things disproportionately impact Black and Indigenous communities and impact the overrepresentation that we see in the system. So all of the disproportionality that exists in the system is fundamentally tied to racism, whether it's directly through racial bias in decision making or because of how racism maintains Black and Indigenous people in poverty. But what's important to point out here before we shift from this myth is the harm that results from this. There is no debate that disproportionality and disparities exist, but this debate that's persisted in the system about whether it's poverty or whether it's racism, in a lot of ways has really stalled efforts over the last couple of decades to address disproportionality. We've seen what was once something that was very, very well discussed in the early 2000s, lots of efforts, lots of philanthropy coming to contribute to this problem. We've seen many of those efforts up until recently end. And the debate also has taken the focus off the harm that results from disproportionality. We know that disproportionate involvement in the system for Black and Indigenous children causes disproportionate harm because of the harm that child welfare intervention causes. When we focus on the debate and not on the harm that results from disproportionality, where the system itself is distracting us from the real problem. So it's time really, the current problem is that this debate still exists, but it's really time for the child welfare field and particular child welfare scholars, child welfare researchers that in many cases are controlling the narrative, to move past the debate and acknowledge that the child welfare system is a deeply flawed system that was founded on racist ideologies, founded on white supremacy, and currently perpetuates racist inequities. And really, it's important to acknowledge that this problem of racial bias in the system, racial disparities, this is not unique to the child welfare system. We've certainly seen how racism and racial bias are a problem in the system of policing. We've seen throughout the pandemic how racism and racial bias lead to significant racial disparities in health outcomes. That's not unique to the child welfare system. So to somehow think that this system is immune to the problem of racial bias when it's present in all of these other systems is ridiculous in many cases, but that is the narrative that's being perpetuated by some people. So we have to start pushing back against that narrative and saying, racism is at the core of all of the disparities that exist in the system, whether that's directly through bias or more indirectly through the disproportionate involvement of Black and Indigenous families who live in poverty. But that leads very well into this next myth, which is the myth about saving children, because much of the narrative that tries to move us away from thinking about racial bias and towards thinking only about poverty comes from a mentality of white saviorism. And here I think it's important to acknowledge the origins of this child saving movement that are present in both the child welfare system and in just the origins of the social work profession for many cases. We saw the profession of social work going back to Jane Addams, going to the time of the settlement houses, which were largely motivated by a child saving mentality, saving children from poverty. We saw the child welfare system in its earliest origins going back to the orphan trains emerge out of a child saving mentality, whereas the orphan children were started out of an effort to save mostly poor white immigrant children from poverty and to relocate them in Midwestern families where they could grow up to be healthy and productive adults. But then we've also seen so we've seen poverty directly associated with child saving, and most of the child saving movement has come from saving children from poverty. And then what we've seen is how this interweaves again with policy. Again, we've seen after the abolition of slavery, these intentional efforts to create policies that intentionally kept Black and Indigenous families living in poverty. And what we've seen is then over time, as the proportion of Black families living in poverty increased, as this wealth gap or the poverty gap increased among more Black families living in poverty, we saw the child welfare system start to disproportionately involve Black families in the system, disproportionately separate Black children from their parents as a way of saving them from what is largely a poverty problem. And I think, that's an important myth to address, is what child welfare is really intervening in, which relates to this next point, how the child welfare system is complicit in harming children. It's important to acknowledge here that what the child welfare system itself is really intervening in is regulation and punishment of families who are living in poverty. We know that more than 60% of children who are in foster care because of what the system deems neglect. And we know that only about 17% of children who are in foster care because of physical or sexual abuse. So what we have here really is a system that separates children from their parents because of poverty, and then places those children in the home of strangers, and then pays those strangers money to take care of someone else's children, when all those children's parents need is money. So the system is not really intervening in situations of harm. The system is regulating and punishing people who are living in poverty. This isn't just about entries into the system. Think about all of the issues that come up when we're preventing children from returning to their families, needing to demonstrate, say, stable employment, stable housing, things that you can't remove children for, but we prevent children from being returned or reunified with their families because of largely poverty-related reasons. And then lastly, I'll close on this last point. I think it's important to acknowledge, what this whole narrative about racial disproportionality obscures. The focus in child welfare systems for many years has been on, and currently is about addressing this issue of disproportionality. But it's important here to acknowledge racial disproportionality is not a problem because of disproportionate representation. Racial disproportionality is a problem because of the racist abuse and harm that child welfare intervention inflicts on Black children and families. I'll stop sharing here for a second just to kind of highlight this point, because there's another myth here that we're not really addressing. That myth is that the child welfare system is a benign helping system that's needed to help families. And it's not. That's a myth in and of itself. When you think of other interventions that are designed to help children, things like TANF, things like early Head Start, the child welfare system is fundamentally different than those systems because the intervention used by the child welfare system is not a benign intervention. The intervention used by child welfare systems, forced family separation and placement in foster care, causes significant harm to children. And we know that from decades of research. Children who spend time in foster care are more likely to experience poverty, low educational attainment, homelessness, mental health concerns, substance use concerns, incarceration. Those things happen to all children. All children who are forcibly separated from their parents are at risk of experiencing those outcomes. But when it comes to Black children and Indigenous children and Indigenous children are already at risk of experiencing poor outcomes in society because of the racism that they contend with every day. When we then disproportionately apply an intervention known to cause harm to them, known to lead to things like homelessness, substance abuse, incarceration, unemployment, the child welfare system itself is acting as an agent of oppression by knowingly causing Black children, Black Indigenous children to experience all of the things that are maintaining their oppression. Which is why the current goal of the child welfare system to focus on racial equity is a terrible goal for the child welfare system to be striving for. Think about what racial equity really means. On the surface, racial equity makes sense. If disproportionality is a problem, then proportionate representation is the solution. But think about what equity means. If the system were to achieve racial equity, all that means is that hundreds of thousands of children are still forcibly separated from their parents. They're just forcibly separated from their parents, equitably distributed by race. But that intervention causes harm. So equitably distributing harm across hundreds of thousands of children is not a solution to the problems of the system. Equitable harm is still harm, and equitably distributing harm is still going to disproportionately impact Black and Indigenous children because of the racism and oppression they already face. So it's time for the child welfare system to acknowledge it's a harmful racist system that needs to be ended. The harm that the system causes is only going to end when the forcible separation of children and families in our society ends. And we recognize that that is an intervention that can no longer be tolerated by a society that cares for children and families.
Okay, so thank you so much for sharing that with us, Dr. Detlef. I know that this is very thought-provoking and probably new information for some folks here. And I first want to start by opening up to Ms. Ruby Whitestar and Deidra to see what comments you would like to make.
Yeah, there's so much there. I was writing things down. I'm like, there's no time for all that. But I do want to mention one thing, because especially to this last comment that Alan made about racial equity, which is we act also like we can carve things up, and if we just take care of this one thing, what we really are more seeking is a commitment to be anti-racist, which is what we're developing what we call the levers for change. But even because we're trying to avoid this, harm everybody equitably. But we do want them to commit to anti-racist practices, one of those levers for change. But that in and of itself is not going to solve the problem either. We also want to transform the system to one that helps families with what they actually need. That's very hard to do when you have $8 billion in removal and foster care and only millions in services and things that people actually need. We're asking them to advance legal protections for people. Right now, people do not, if in states where they actually get lawyers to understand anything that's going on, it's late in the process when they're going to be removed, not during investigation, when they can know their rights. There's no grievance procedures. So we're asking for many more levers. We're asking for partnerships with culturally specific communities for them to nurture. Change is actually an acronym. Which is kind of where I'm going here. It's nurturing partnerships. We're asking for the generation of relevant research, which has come up over and over, that the research is actually perpetuating these inequities. And we're asking for eliminations of incentives for removal. Because right now, the way the money is distributed, you make money by removing children because of this $8 billion. And families who they give children to are resourced, while families that they're taken away are just judged and harmed. And so I really appreciate this. I know there's not a lot of time, but I just wanted to say these levers of change are really important, because no one thing is going to, and it's definitely not harming everybody equitably.
Deidra, I'd invite if you'd like to make any comments at this point.
No, I think that was very interesting, Ellen, and I love the way you put it. And one of the things that I just wanted to affirm was I was the 9th of 10 children and the only one given up for adoption. And obviously that was years ago, and that was in Chicago, and that was the reason that I was removed, because my mother was receiving benefits from the state. And after the 8th child, she was told, you will lose money for all your other children. So she had no other choice. But there was another one after me. And so we know that didn't work, right? It only causes more harm. And so, Alan, I just wanted to put that caveat to what you said. You're absolutely right. And what it made me think of is, wow, that was back, I'll tell my age, 1959, and we're still doing the same thing, removing for poverty. This has to change. And I think someone had asked, if I can, Becky, about the juveniles, about incarceration and children in foster care. And we do know that more children are in foster care. They're called on when they're raise their voices and in group homes and all kinds of things. And you can find that information online. And also that's why the Crossover Youth program started, so that children would stop going into both systems, but it is still a major issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, well, I want to, I've posted the Padlet 3 in the chat and invite you all to answer a question that we have there, which is, do you find yourself wanting to save families who are poor? If so, why? If not, why? So really trying to interrogate this idea of white saviorism in our child welfare system.
I want to, while we're doing that, Becky, I want to add, because I heard a story, because sometimes we don't think of it that intentionally. I heard a story, sometimes it comes out just in the way we view it. It comes out sometimes in just they're better off, and it's based on certain values that maybe we have. But I heard a story of workers who had tried to help this family. They had gotten them the white picket fence home because they lived in a community where it was with 5 kids, and they did all this work because they knew homelessness was important. So and then they're like, we did all this work to get them this house where all the kids had their own rooms, and they all this. And then the mother, after X amount of times, went back to an apartment in the community that she was from. And they just were reflecting on it as, after everything we've done, she didn't appreciate that. And when we were able to talk with the mom, she talked about how miserable she was, how depressed, how bad her mental health, being away. She was completely disconnected with her community in this suburb that had no people that looked like her. Her kids didn't care about having their own room. They cared about being together and feeling whole. And it was sometimes it's these, and they were only able to reflect on that many, many years later when they started educating themselves on anti-racist practice. And so I just wanted to say that sometimes it's hard for us to see the forest through the trees in the ways that the ways we think someone's better off. It will influence this particular thing that we're talking about right now.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, Ribby.
Can I say one other thing? And what we know is children return to where they last knew their parents were, right? So when they get old enough or when they can, they return home. And so if we're doing harm, that return home is not going to be as pleasant as it could be if that child has some security about who they are. We know they're going home, right? Most of them do, that's going to happen. So if we can shore them up until they can return home and make those decisions better, I think that would be very helpful for children and families.
I wanted to say to you, Dr. Detlef, just to say thank you for bringing out this acknowledgement of harm and really putting forth a call to action to make significant change in what you're saying to end our current child welfare system.
Thanks, Becky. I think it's something that the system itself and the general public don't focus on enough and understand the idea that we're in the system's attempts to respond to harm, they're actually perpetuating more harm. And we need to be thinking of other ways to respond to harm in society.
I know that you've put forward several ways that you think that we should. I've read your work on that. Do you want to mention some of those?
Yeah, I'd love to refer people to the Up In movement is a movement that is advocating for abolition of the child welfare system. We have a policy paper that we wrote last summer. It's called How We End Up. It's available at our website. It's upinmovement.org. But it lays out our kind of big picture ideas on how to move towards abolition. Abolition in many ways is not just about ending things. Abolition is about building and creating new things. So, we talk about the need to repeal mandatory reporting laws, to end involuntary separations, to repeal ASFA, and ultimately to abolish the system. But then we also talk about what we can build. We talk about building and creating new policies that are going to really provide for what families need. And that's looking at things like guaranteed incomes, child allowances, access to healthcare, access to mental health care, access to substance use services for people who want to access those services, focusing on things like harm reduction. There was just a story in the New York Times yesterday that I could, if people didn't see it, I could find the link probably, that showed that providing financial assistance to mothers to parents while they're pregnant can significantly impact the development of children later in life. So there's significant relationships between increased financial assistance and reductions in maltreatment and child welfare involvement.
Dr. Detlef, we're going to go in Q&A here in a moment, but I feel like this would be appropriate to ask this question at this time. Because there is a question about, there is a reality that there could be significant harm in the home. And we're talking about trying to prevent that from happening. How are you answering that question when people are asking you, well, what if something horrible is happening to a child and they just have to be taken from the home, and we're saying abolish the system? So how have you addressed that question?
Yeah, thanks, Brandy. That's absolutely the question that I get the most from people when I talk about this issue. And I could answer that in a couple ways. First, when people say, what should we do if there's not a child welfare system? What should we do with children who are being harmed? I could say back, which ones? Do you mean the tens of thousands of children who are being abused by staff in congregate care facilities? Do you mean the thousands of children who are being horribly abused by their foster parents? The system itself is not able to protect children from harm. And I think that's important to point out. But really, I think in many ways, the question about what should we do with, if there's not a child welfare system, what should we do with children who are being, or what would happen to children who are being harmed, is not the right question. I think we need to be asking ourselves, why do we live in a society where children are severely harmed by their parents? And what can we do about that? That's the important question. That's the question that abolitionists ask ourselves. And that's the question that I think we all should be focusing on. What can we do when harm occurs? And particularly, what can we do when harm occurs that doesn't result in further harm? Right now, we know that removal and separation causes additional harm. And we can collectively think of better ways to respond to that as a society.
Okay, thank you all so much. I saw lots of really thoughtful responses on the Padlet. And, but I think I'm gonna skip past that right now so we can move toward our question and answer time. And I'm gonna ask that our poll be posted now. So the question is, Groundhog's Day is coming up. Who is ready for spring?
Me, I'm ready right now.
You had it 2 days ago. It went away.
I did. I needed to say.
So if you haven't already asked a question that you want to ask, feel free to post it in our Q&A. And it looks like 88% of us are ready for spring. So thank you all. Am I turning this to you now, Brandy?
I believe so. Sorry, I couldn't get my thing to unmute. So we are going to move into some question and answers. I want to again thank all of our panelists for being here. You really did stretch my edges and just got me thinking about some things that maybe I haven't before, and I really appreciate that, and challenging some of my thoughts and understandings when it comes down to child welfare. So I really appreciate your boldness, your vulnerability, and your willingness to stand up for the cause. I really appreciate that. So we're going to go move into some questions and answers, and I'm going to open this up to any of the panelists that want to answer. And I'll just start off with, how do you feel we can recruit a wider net of foster care parents and providers? We'll just start with that one to get the conversation going.
I will start by saying you need to be in the community. You need to have people from the community who believe and who know the children and the families, who know the churches, who knows who they call auntie down the street and grandma across the street, and who can support and help families. And we need to look at what our laws and rules are around being a foster parent, because the majority of BIPOC children are not placed with their family members, and part of that is the poverty. So I think that we need to make sure that we have people in the community who are championing what we do, the child welfare work that we need to do.
Thank you for that, Ms. Deidra. Any other thoughts around that question?
Yeah, I have a couple, because I tried to do that. I tried to become a foster care parent at one time. It was the most frustrating process in what they, in the who they allow. And I think it seemed like the only people that were allowed, you have to have great privilege where you do not work, where, because they needed, even I was trying to do youth, because I had heard they were the hardest, but it was like, you have to be home all the time. And I'm like, oh, well, I'll just be at work from 3 to 5. I'm wanting the 15 to 17-year-olds. It didn't matter. Like, they couldn't be home alone for those 2 hours. So I was not eligible unless I, had a second party that could be home with them full time. And that's just like one thing, but it was like, it felt like you either had to have that or you had to have great need. I mean, people who, were home needed to foster people to, to raise their own children I just found so many things that were problematic. And on top of that, the things that we've seen happening is there'll be great families of color. We saw one recently where the grandfather 20 years ago, it was, had been arrested, for something and is ruled out for something and when you talk about all the things that Alan just talked about and that we've all talked about, how this is all cumulative and how racism is a part, most likely of even why he was in the system to begin with 20 years ago. And just some of the things that we hold on to and carry as a result of our racist views and biases, that's what I call rearranging our biases sometimes, is we say it's for this when it's really for that. And if we don't stop doing that, we're never going to get, families that are interested, because, we're very willing to put children of color in white families, but we don't put we don't put white children with people of color. And that's another, right? So there's all kinds of problems with the way we're operating right now, and that need to be totally looked at completely different than they are now.
Thank you, Ruby. Dr. Detlef, I see you unmuted. Do you have anything to say on this?
Yeah, I was going to answer it a slightly different way. We don't need more foster parents. We need to recognize that children already have parents, and we need to be working and doing everything we can to keep those children in their homes. Think about this for a second. What do rich white people do when their family's in crisis and when they're stressed and overwhelmed and having problems? They go to therapy. They hire someone to come into their home and help them with their kids. Rich white people's kids don't go into foster care. That's not what we should be striving for, looking for more parents to put more children in foster care. There are other solutions that we can be looking for that keep children in their homes because they already have parents.
Thank you for that. So any final thoughts? Because this is a hard question to transition from, because you just gave us a mouthful to think about. But any final thoughts before I move on and recognize another question? Okay, Ms. Ruby, this one is for you. It says, when thinking about cultural practice, acknowledging and responding to differences, how would this look like in the workplace?
Wow, I wish I had time we have actually developed this whole in the workplace kind of how change occurs and how we think of change happening traditionally in our workplaces and in our culture. And we think of change as this linear kind of things are perfect, but the way it plays out in the workplace is very chaotic. And typically what happens is we start talking about doing this, and then we get to this place where it gets hard. Because when you do this kind of stuff in the workplace, when you're acknowledging different, when you're wanting people to come with their whole self, that gets messy. And we're not comfortable with messy. And that's one of the things about white supremacy, right? Is as soon as we get uncomfortable, let's do an ad hoc committee to discuss this before further. We put all kinds of things in place where we're not going to be able to move forward. So being able to do this in the workplace is not a question. It's not something that we can answer in 2 minutes. It is a full range of ways that we need to think about it. I did recently do a small document on just like strategies that one can implement in the workplace. I'll put it in the to be more, I don't want to say, it's not about diversity and inclusion, but how to be more equitable when doing this work and the kinds of things you have to think about. And I'll put it here, but there's a lot of work in that area, and a lot of people who are doing it not thoughtfully or intentionally, and it's creating or wreaking havoc and stopping progress. And so I would encourage people to look, maybe contact us in the future or look into that further, but I'll put a couple of things in the chat.
Okay, thank you. A couple of things that you said that really kind of stand out is it sounds like first we need to understand what it really means to allow someone to come as their most authentic self. And that also goes back to what you said earlier about that means you have to know yourself. So in order to understand cultural competency within the workplace, it takes knowing yourself and being open and willing to know what it means to allow someone to be their true authentic selves. Am I on the right track when I say that, Ms. Ruby?
That's part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's part of it. But what happens in the workplace is when we just think about it as let everybody be their full authentic self. So what happens when that butts up with, and I say this because I've been in groups where everybody in the workplace is also people of color.
Mm-hmm.
And we're all bringing our full authentic selves, but that's also butting up with other people's full authentic selves, whether you're white or not. And so, yes, that is true. And what does that mean for a workplace? Because we also bring our own histories and our own traumas and our own, you know, and then we're still operating in systems that are operating with all of the white supremacist values of deadlines and doing more with less and worshiping the written word and all of those things that we're not addressing. And so then it can also become very superficial. So it's a big body of work and very complex. It has to be done very intentionally.
Thank you for calling that out. That's very important. It's not a checkbox movement. It takes a lot more skill. All right. Is there a difference between color blindness at an institutional level and color blindness at an individual level? Anyone want to take that? And it says, just to kind of expound on that a little bit, it says, in other words, do you think an attitude of judging each individual as a person, judged on his own or her own merits, is what many people mean when they say, I don't view color?
I'm not sure about that second thing, but I would say that I think sometimes I've seen some interventions that try to train individuals to treat people different. This is, to me, what's part of the, when we're talking about it on an individual level, we're thinking we can fix people, that we can educate people into doing things differently, but they operate within a system that is already set up and structured in a particular way. And the mechanisms are in place to do a particular thing. And you will be punished oftentimes for not doing it that way. So there's a lot of great judges who have changed how they do things in their particular courtroom, which is great on an individual level. But the problem then becomes, who gets to be in that court versus the other 8, because it kind of is, it to me is synonymous with when I was talking with Alan about this, how we agree with so many elements of the abolition. And in the meantime, we have all these people and families that are suffering. And so it's almost like a parallel process where we're trying to make change while we blow the thing up. And it's similar to me with the individual versus systemic. It's like the difference is we can make our own individual changes, but if we're not changing policy, if we're not blowing the thing up structurally, it doesn't have the kind of impact that it needs to have. But I don't want to also act like respecting someone as an individual doesn't matter. It does, but it's not going to do everything we need.
Thank you. Any other thoughts around that? Okay, I think we have time for one more question. I think this will close us out. And, how can we impact racism beyond recognizing it's a real thing? We identify it as a problem, but what next? And that's open to anyone.
You got to talk about it. You got to have those uncomfortable conversations that talk about it, and you have to spar to action. You can't just keep talking. That's not going to help. And so I think when we start looking at our values and where we come from with those, we can all come to some collective, most people, belief in the same values. And I think we have to look at that. And so I think it's time out for sitting and talking. It's time to take action, have the conversation and move it forward. things are never going to be perfect. You got to take some calculated risk when you think about this and know that you get support from the community when you are authentic. Now, some communities don't have anything to give. I understand that as far as monetary things, but grandma down the street is home today and she could take care of my child while I can't. You know, there's all kinds of things we can do, but I think first of all, we need to start having the conversation and we need to spar those conversations into action items.
Thank you, Ms. Deidra. Dr. Detlef, what's next?
I'd say to put this in like directly in the context of the child welfare system. I mean, first, yes, I completely agree. The child welfare system needs to be having these conversations. First, acknowledge that racism is a problem in the system. Then acknowledge the harm that the racism that exists in the system perpetuates. But it's not enough then to stop it. That's often what happens. The system will acknowledge it has a problem with racism. It will acknowledge that it causes harm. But what really needs to happen is that then the system needs to commit to ending that harm. It's not enough to say you're sorry. You know, we've seen lots of statements come out like apologies for histories of racism within systems. That's not enough. You need to commit to stop doing harm. And until the system commits to doing that, any acknowledgement, conversation that they have about racism is useless. They need to commit to stop perpetuating harm, which means they need to commit to stop forcibly separating children from their families.
Thank you. Ruby?
Yeah, I want to go off just for related, but not exactly directly. I put a bunch of resources that we've developed that had to do with workplace. And sometimes it's about our own workplace. And sometimes it's about, we don't have the answers and we don't have to become the experts. We should be working and collaborating meaningfully in transformative ways with others. So I included that. But then there's also the broader, when we're talking about our workplace, it's how our workplaces are connected to other systems, like in collaborative community groups. And so we also did I want to call it an assessment. That's not the right term for it, but we created a survey kind of for when you're doing those big task force groups. We did it with KU. So I shared that as well with the School of Social Work. And I think there's knowledge that can be gained and gleaned for how we operate in the broader systems too, and how we assess ourselves and how we're doing in that. So hopefully some of the things we're talking, that we're wondering or talking about will be found in some of those resources that I put in the chat.
Well, thank you. Excellent conversation today, everyone. Excellent. Thank you so much for your time, your words, your wisdom, your knowledge. I really appreciate it. I'm going to pass it over to Chanel again to close us out. We really enjoyed you. Just thank you for being here.
Thank you. And please allow me to echo those thoughts. You all, we had a practice session and the core collaborators walked away and we said, this one's going to be good. We know that there would be conversations and viewpoints and perspectives that we oftentimes don't hear when we're in our work. But it's important that we, as a state, as we're going on our learning journey, right? Because you have to understand how it started, how we got here, and then where we're going. We're building upon this experience. And so this hopefully has exposed you to different viewpoints. Doesn't mean you agree with everything, but it doesn't mean you disagree with everything, right? So there is, it's the analogy of the table. Don't eat the greens, but eat the yams, right? The yams are good. And so again, thank you to our panelists for the excellent work that they brought forth and shared. Just a couple of reminders. Number one, there is a survey that is in the chat that was just shared. Please be sure to respond to that. Also, there is the registration for Lecture 4. And Lecture 4 is about, all right, so how do we go from control to support of Black and Brown families, right? So again, we're building upon this thing on February 23rd.